Martin Van Buren was a shrewd political operator and masterful strategist who became the 8th President of the United States. Martin Van Buren, the first president born as an American citizen, was born in Kinderhook, New York on December 5, 1782. He came from humble Dutch origins. He had a diminutive stature, standing only 5 feet 6 inches tall. Van Buren's family ran a tavern and farm. He was educated in local schools until the age of 14 when he began studying law. Then in 1803, at age 21, Van Buren was admitted to the New York bar and opened his own law practice in Kinderhook. Martin Van Buren was a self-made man who rose through sheer political skill. In 1807, Van Buren married his childhood sweetheart Hannah Hose. Hannah was also of Dutch descent from Kinderhook. They had 4 sons together before Hannah died of tuberculosis in 1819. Van Buren never remarried, and Hannah's death profoundly affected him throughout his life. Van Buren entered politics at a young age. He was appointed surrogate of Columbia County in 1808. He began to build a powerful political organization in New York. Van Buren understood that politics was about loyalty and patronage. He created what became known as the Albany Regency, a sophisticated political machine that controlled New York politics for decades. The Albany Regency was one of the first modern political machines in America. It rewarded supporters with government jobs and punished enemies by withholding patronage. In 1812, Van Buren was elected to the New York State Senate. He served in the state Senate while building his political base. Van Buren was a master of backroom dealing and coalition building. He knew how to count votes and how to deliver them when it mattered. During his time in the state Senate, Van Buren became a leader of the Bucktails, a faction of the Democratic-Republican Party in New York that opposed the political machine of DeWitt Clinton. Van Buren was a Jeffersonian Republican who believed in limited federal government and states' rights. He opposed the nationalist policies of the era. In 1821, Van Buren was elected to the United States Senate. As a senator, Van Buren quickly became one of the most influential politicians in Washington. He was known for his elegant dress and courtly manners. His opponents called him the Little Magician because of his political skills. They also called him the Red Fox of Kinderhook because of his red hair and cunning nature. In the Senate, Van Buren opposed the policies of President John Quincy Adams. Van Buren believed Adams represented the old Federalist elite. He worked to build a new political coalition that would bring together Northern workers, Southern planters, and Western farmers. Van Buren saw the need for a new national political party. He became one of the principal architects of the Democratic Party. Van Buren believed that political parties were essential to democracy. He thought parties organized public opinion and gave voters real choices. Van Buren formed an alliance with Andrew Jackson. He recognized that Jackson was immensely popular with ordinary Americans. Van Buren helped organize Jackson's presidential campaign in 1828. Van Buren's political machine in New York delivered crucial votes for Jackson. When Jackson won the presidency, Van Buren's influence grew enormously. In 1829, President Jackson appointed Van Buren as Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Van Buren became Jackson's most trusted advisor. He was part of Jackson's kitchen cabinet, an informal group of advisors who had more influence than the official cabinet. Van Buren skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of Jackson's administration. The administration was torn apart by the Petticoat Affair, a scandal involving the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton. Peggy Eaton was snubbed by the wives of other cabinet members who considered her morally questionable. Van Buren, as a widower, was not affected by the social controversy. He befriended Peggy Eaton and defended her in social situations. Van Buren's handling of the Petticoat Affair increased Jackson's trust in him. In 1831, Van Buren resigned as Secretary of State to help Jackson reorganize his cabinet. Jackson rewarded Van Buren by appointing him Minister to Great Britain. However, the Senate rejected Van Buren's appointment in a tie vote broken by Vice President John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, who had broken with Jackson, thought he was destroying Van Buren's political career. Instead, the rejection made Van Buren a martyr and increased his popularity. Jackson chose Van Buren as his running mate in 1832. Van Buren was elected vice president. As vice president, Van Buren continued to be Jackson's closest advisor. He supported Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson believed the bank was a corrupt institution that favored the wealthy elite over ordinary Americans. Van Buren agreed with Jackson's assessment. The bank war became the defining issue of Jackson's presidency. In 1836, Jackson handpicked Van Buren as his successor. Van Buren ran on Jackson's record and promised to continue Jackson's policies. Van Buren faced multiple opponents from the newly formed Whig Party. The Whigs ran different regional candidates hoping to deny Van Buren an electoral majority. But Van Buren's political organization proved too strong. He won the election with 170 electoral votes. Van Buren became the first president born after American independence. He was also the first president of Dutch rather than British ancestry. On March 4, 1837, Martin Van Buren was sworn in as the 8th President of the United States. Van Buren inherited a strong economy from Jackson. But within weeks of Van Buren's inauguration, the country plunged into economic crisis. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst financial crises in American history. Banks failed across the country. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. The panic was caused by several factors including speculation in Western lands, inflation, and the collapse of cotton prices. Van Buren's response to the panic was shaped by his political philosophy. He believed the government should not interfere in the economy. Van Buren thought the panic was caused by excessive speculation and easy credit. He believed the economy would correct itself naturally. Van Buren opposed government intervention to help struggling businesses or unemployed workers. This laissez-faire approach made Van Buren deeply unpopular. Americans suffering from the Depression blamed Van Buren for their hardships. Van Buren's major policy initiative was the creation of an independent treasury system. He proposed that the government keep its funds in its own vaults rather than in private banks. Van Buren argued this would prevent the government from contributing to speculation and economic instability. The independent treasury proposal was controversial. It took years of political fighting before Congress finally passed it in 1840. The independent treasury system represented Van Buren's commitment to separating government from banking. Van Buren faced other challenges during his presidency. Tensions with Great Britain flared over the border between Maine and Canada. The Aroostook War, as it was called, nearly led to armed conflict. Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott to negotiate a truce. The crisis was eventually resolved peacefully. Van Buren also faced controversy over Texas. Many Americans wanted to annex Texas, which had won independence from Mexico. But Van Buren opposed annexation because it would add another slave state and might provoke war with Mexico. Van Buren's position on slavery was complex and politically calculated. He was personally opposed to slavery but believed the federal government had no power to interfere with it in the states where it existed. Van Buren supported the gag rule in Congress that prevented discussion of anti-slavery petitions. He believed this was necessary to preserve the Union and keep the Democratic Party coalition together. Van Buren walked a careful line trying to maintain support from both Northern and Southern Democrats. The slavery issue became more heated during Van Buren's presidency. In 1839, enslaved Africans seized control of the Spanish ship Amistad off the coast of Cuba. The ship ended up in American waters and the Africans were imprisoned in Connecticut. Spain demanded their return. Abolitionists argued the Africans should be freed. Van Buren sided with Spain and wanted to return the Africans. But the courts ruled the Africans had been illegally enslaved and should be freed. The Amistad case highlighted the growing sectional tensions over slavery. Van Buren's presidency was marked by continued economic depression. The economy briefly recovered in 1838 but collapsed again in 1839. This second downturn was even worse than the first. Van Buren's popularity plummeted. His opponents called him Martin Van Ruin. They blamed him for the depression even though the causes were largely beyond his control. The Whigs portrayed Van Buren as an aristocrat who lived in luxury while ordinary Americans suffered. In the 1840 election, Van Buren faced Whig candidate William Henry Harrison. Harrison was a war hero who had fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Whigs ran a brilliant campaign. They portrayed Harrison as a man of the people who lived in a log cabin and drank hard cider. They depicted Van Buren as an effete dandy who drank champagne from gold cups. The log cabin campaign was one of the first modern political campaigns with rallies, songs, and slogans. The Whig slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referring to Harrison and his running mate John Tyler. Van Buren ran on his record, but the Depression made him vulnerable. He could not overcome the economic crisis. Harrison won in a landslide with 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. Van Buren carried only 7 states. It was a crushing defeat. On March 4, 1841, Van Buren left office and returned to his estate in Kinderhook called Lindenwold. He was only 58 years old and his political career seemed over. But Van Buren was not ready to retire from politics. He remained active in Democratic Party affairs. In 1844, Van Buren sought the Democratic nomination for president. He was the front-runner for the nomination. But Van Buren opposed the immediate annexation of Texas. His position cost him support from Southern Democrats. At the Democratic Convention, Van Buren could not get the 2/3 majority needed for nomination. After multiple ballots, the convention nominated James K. Polk as a compromise candidate. Van Buren felt betrayed by the party he had helped create. Van Buren's views on slavery evolved after he left the presidency. He became increasingly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. In 1848, Van Buren made a surprising political comeback. He accepted the presidential nomination of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soilers opposed the extension of slavery into the Western Territories. Their slogan was Free Soil, Free Speech, Free Labor, and Free Men. Van Buren's decision to run as a Free Soiler split the Democratic Party in New York. Van Buren knew he could not win the presidency as a Free Soiler. But he wanted to make a statement about slavery. He believed the slave power, as he called it, had too much influence in the Democratic Party. Van Buren won no electoral votes in 1848, but he received over 291,000 popular votes, about 10% of the total. His candidacy helped Whig candidate Zachary Taylor defeat Democrat Lewis Cass. Van Buren's Free Soil campaign marked the beginning of the end for the second party system. After 1848, Van Buren retired from politics for good. He spent his final years at Lindenwold managing his estate. He traveled to Europe in 1853 and 1854. Van Buren remained interested in politics but did not seek office again. He watched with concern as the sectional crisis over slavery intensified. Van Buren feared the Union he had worked to preserve was coming apart. He lived long enough to see the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Van Buren supported the Union cause during the Civil War. He endorsed the policies of President Abraham Lincoln. Van Buren believed preserving the Union was paramount. On July 24, 1862, Martin Van Buren died at Lindenwold at the age of 79. He died from asthma and heart failure. Van Buren was buried in Kinderhook Cemetery in his hometown. Martin Van Buren's legacy is complex and often overlooked. He was one of the most skilled politicians in American history. Van Buren helped create the modern two-party system. He understood that political parties could organize democracy and give structure to political debate. The Democratic Party that Van Buren helped build dominated American politics for decades. Van Buren pioneered many political techniques that are still used today, including party discipline, patronage, and machine politics. As president, Van Buren faced enormous challenges. The Panic of 1837 destroyed his presidency. His refusal to use government power to address the Depression reflected his political philosophy but made him unpopular. Van Buren believed in limited government and feared that government intervention would create more problems than it solved. His independent treasury system was an important reform that lasted for decades. Van Buren maintained peace with Great Britain and avoided war with Mexico. These were significant achievements even if they were overshadowed by the economic crisis. Van Buren's position on slavery was his greatest moral failure. He subordinated his personal opposition to slavery to political expediency. Van Buren believed that taking a strong stand against slavery would destroy the Democratic Party and the Union. He was willing to tolerate slavery where it existed to preserve national unity. Only after he left office did Van Buren take a principled stand against the expansion of slavery. His Free Soil campaign in 1848 showed that he was capable of putting principle above party loyalty, but it came too late to define his legacy. Van Buren was a transitional figure in American politics. He bridged the era of the Founding Fathers and the age of mass democracy. Van Buren was the first president born as an American citizen and the first from humble origins. He proved that someone without wealth or family connections could rise to the highest office through political skill and hard work. Van Buren was a professional politician at a time when that was not considered respectable. He made politics his career and showed that political organization was essential to democratic governance. Van Buren's personality shaped his political career. He was charming and sociable but also secretive and calculating. Van Buren rarely revealed his true thoughts. He was famous for being able to talk at length without committing to a position. His opponents mocked him as a political chameleon who changed his views to suit the moment. But Van Buren's caution and flexibility were also his strengths. He knew when to compromise and when to stand firm. Van Buren understood that politics was the art of the possible. Van Buren's contributions to American political development were significant. He helped establish the principle that political parties were legitimate and necessary institutions. Before Van Buren, many Americans viewed parties as dangerous factions. Van Buren argued that parties organized public opinion and made democracy work. He showed how parties could mobilize voters and hold politicians accountable. The party system that Van Buren helped create structured American politics for generations. Van Buren also pioneered the use of patronage to build party loyalty. The spoils system, as it was called, rewarded party supporters with government jobs. Van Buren believed this created a loyal party organization. Critics argued that patronage led to corruption and incompetence in government. Both views had merit. Patronage did build strong party organizations, but it also encouraged corruption. The spoils system dominated American politics until civil service reform in the late 19th century. Van Buren's presidency fell short of his abilities. He was a much better politician than president. Van Buren excelled at building coalitions and managing party affairs. But he struggled with the economic crisis that defined his presidency. Van Buren's rigid adherence to limited government principles prevented him from taking bold action to address the Depression. He lacked the vision and leadership to guide the nation through crisis. Van Buren was a political tactician rather than a statesman. Yet Van Buren deserves credit for maintaining democratic institutions during difficult times. He accepted his defeat in 1840 gracefully and left office peacefully. Van Buren respected the will of the voters even when they rejected him. He continued to participate in democratic politics after leaving the presidency. Van Buren's commitment to democracy and the rule of law was never in question. He believed in the American constitutional system even when it did not serve his interests. Van Buren's later opposition to the expansion of slavery showed moral growth. He recognized that the slave power threatened free labor and democratic institutions. Van Buren's Free Soil campaign helped lay the groundwork for the Republican Party. His willingness to break with the Democratic Party over slavery demonstrated courage. Van Buren sacrificed his position in the party he had built to take a stand on principle. This act of political courage partially redeemed his earlier compromises on slavery. Martin Van Buren was a pivotal figure in the development of American democracy. He transformed American politics by creating the first modern political party. Van Buren showed that democracy required organization and that parties could provide that organization. His political innovations shaped how Americans practiced democracy. Van Buren's career illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of democratic politics. He rose from obscurity to the presidency through talent and hard work. But he also showed how political calculation could lead to moral compromise. Van Buren remains one of the least remembered presidents. His presidency was overshadowed by the economic depression and sandwiched between the more memorable administrations of Andrew Jackson and the sectional crisis that led to civil war. But Van Buren's contributions to American political development were profound. He helped create the political system that Americans still use today. Van Buren was the little magician who made American democracy work through party organization and political skill. Even in historical obscurity, Van Buren's legacy endures in the institutions and practices he pioneered. William Henry Harrison was a frontier soldier and political leader who became the 9th President of the United States, only to die after the shortest term in presidential history. William Henry Harrison, the 9th United States President, was born in Charles City County, Virginia on February 9, 1773. He came from one of the most distinguished families in Virginia. He was the son of Benjamin Harrison, the 5th, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Harrison's upbringing was privileged. He received an excellent classical education at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. The young Harrison initially studied medicine in Philadelphia under the renowned Dr. Benjamin Rush, but when his father died in 1791, leaving him without financial support, the 18-year-old Harrison abandoned his medical studies and joined the United States Army, seeking adventure and opportunity on the American frontier. Harrison received his commission as an ensign in the 1st Infantry Regiment and was sent to the Northwest Territory, where he would spend the next decade of his life fighting Native Americans and building his military reputation. He served under General Anthony Wayne and participated in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1790 for a decisive victory over a confederation of Native American tribes that opened up the Northwest Territory to American settlement. Harrison proved himself to be a capable and brave officer. He earned rapid promotions, and by 1797 he had risen to the rank of captain. But Harrison was ambitious, and he saw that his future lay not just in military service but in the political administration of the expanding Western territories. In 1798, Harrison resigned from the army to become Secretary of the Northwest Territory, and within a year he was elected as the territory's delegate to Congress. As a delegate, Harrison championed the interests of Western settlers. He successfully promoted legislation that made it easier for ordinary citizens to purchase public land by reducing the minimum acreage required and allowing payment in installments. This land policy helped accelerate westward expansion and made Harrison popular among frontier families who saw him as their advocate in the distant halls of government in the nation's capital. In 1800, when the Northwest Territory was divided, President John Adams appointed the 27-year-old Harrison as governor of the newly created Indiana Territory. Harrison would serve as territorial governor for 12 years, making him one of the longest-serving governors in American history. As governor, Harrison had enormous power and responsibility. He was the chief executive, the superintendent of Indian affairs, and the commander of the territorial militia. His primary mission was to obtain title to Native American lands and open them for white settlement, and in this task he was remarkably successful, negotiating treaty after treaty that transferred millions of acres from Native American tribes to the United States government. Harrison was a skilled negotiator, but his methods were often questionable. He used alcohol, bribes, threats, and manipulation to convince tribal leaders to sign away their ancestral lands. He exploited divisions among different tribes, and he made agreements with chiefs who did not necessarily have the authority to speak for their people. Between 1802 and 1809, Harrison negotiated at least 13 treaties that acquired vast territories in present-day Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The Native Americans received modest payments and annuities in exchange for land that would become some of the most valuable agricultural territory in North America. Many Native Americans felt cheated and resentful, and tensions between settlers and native peoples continued to escalate throughout Harrison's governorship. The most formidable opponent Harrison faced was Tecumseh, a Shawnee warrior and leader who sought to unite all the tribes of the Northwest and South into a great confederation that could resist American expansion. Tecumseh was a brilliant orator and military strategist. He traveled from tribe to tribe, urging Native Americans to reject the treaties that Harrison had negotiated and to stand together against the encroachment of white settlers. Tecumseh argued that the land belonged to all Native Americans collectively and that no individual chief had the right to sell tribal territory. He established a village called Prophetstown near the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers, where his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, led a religious revival that rejected white culture and called for a return to traditional Native American ways. Harrison viewed Tecumseh's Confederation as a grave threat to American interests, and he was determined to break it before it could grow too powerful. In 1811, while Tecumseh was away in the South recruiting additional tribes to his cause, Harrison marched an army of about 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. On November 7, 1811, Harrison's forces camped near the village, and before dawn the next morning, warriors led by Tenskwatawa launched a surprise attack on the American camp. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fierce and chaotic, fought in darkness and confusion. Harrison's men held their ground and eventually drove off the attackers, who retreated and abandoned Prophetstown. Harrison's troops burned the village and destroyed its supplies. The Battle of Tippecanoe was not a decisive military victory. The casualties were roughly equal on both sides, and Harrison's forces withdrew shortly after the engagement. But Harrison claimed a great triumph, and newspapers in the East celebrated him as the hero of Tippecanoe, the man who had defeated the Indian Confederation and made the frontier safe for settlement. The battle made Harrison a national figure and gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Old Tippecanoe became a symbol of frontier courage and military leadership, even though the battle had actually accomplished relatively little and had driven many Native Americans into alliance with the British as the War of 1812 approached. When war with Britain broke out in 1812, Harrison was commissioned as a brigadier general and given command of the Army of the Northwest. The early stages of the war went badly for the Americans. British and Native American forces captured Detroit and threatened to overrun the entire Northwest Territory. Harrison spent much of 1812 and 1813 building up his army and preparing for a campaign to retake Detroit and invade Canada. He was a careful and methodical commander. He understood the importance of logistics and supply lines, and he worked to ensure his troops were well equipped and well trained before launching major operations. In the fall of 1813, Harrison finally launched his offensive after American naval forces under Oliver Hazard Perry won control of Lake Erie. Harrison's army crossed into Canada in pursuit of the retreating British and their Native American allies. On October 5, 1813, Harrison's forces caught up with the British and Native Americans near the Thames River in Ontario. The Battle of the Thames was a complete American victory. The British forces were routed and Tecumseh was killed in the fighting. With Tecumseh's death, the Native American Confederation collapsed and the British threat to the Northwest Territory was eliminated. Harrison was hailed as a hero once again, and his military reputation was at its peak. After the War of 1812 ended, Harrison remained in the army briefly but resigned in 1814 and returned to his farm in North Bend, Ohio near Cincinnati. He had married Anna Tuthill Sims in 1795 and together they had 10 children. Harrison's farm was modest and he struggled financially despite his fame and military achievements. He was not a skilled farmer or businessman and he had trouble making ends meet. To supplement his income, Harrison accepted a series of government appointments. He served in the Ohio State Legislature. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives and later to the United States Senate. He also served briefly as the American Minister to Colombia in South America, but he clashed with President Andrew Jackson's administration and was recalled after less than a year. Harrison's political career was respectable but not distinguished. He was seen as a reliable and honorable public servant, but not as a particularly brilliant or innovative thinker. His politics were generally aligned with the Whig Party, which opposed Andrew Jackson, and the Democrats. The Whigs favored a strong national government support for internal improvements like roads and canals and a national bank. Harrison was not deeply ideological, but he was ambitious and he harbored dreams of higher office. By the late 1830s, the Whig Party was looking for a candidate who could defeat the Democrats and win the presidency, and they began to see Harrison as a potentially strong contender. In 1836, the Whigs ran several regional candidates for president, including Harrison, who carried several western states but lost to Democrat Martin Van Buren. The Whigs learned from this defeat, and in 1840 they united behind Harrison as their single candidate. The Whig campaign of 1840 was one of the most colorful and innovative in American political history. Rather than focusing on issues or policy, the Whigs built their campaign around Harrison's image as a frontier military hero. They portrayed him as a simple man of the people who lived in a log cabin and drank hard cider, even though Harrison actually came from an aristocratic Virginia family and lived in a substantial house. The campaign used songs, parades, rallies, and all manner of promotional materials to create enthusiasm for their candidate. The Whigs gave Harrison the campaign slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," pairing him with vice presidential candidate John Tyler of Virginia. The slogan was catchy and memorable, and it reminded voters of Harrison's military exploits nearly 30 years earlier. The Democrats tried to attack Harrison by suggesting he was too old at age 67 and too feeble to be president, but the Whigs turned these attacks to their advantage by emphasizing Harrison's long record of service to his country. The Democrats also tried to focus on substantive issues, but the Whigs largely avoided detailed policy discussions and kept the campaign focused on personality and image. The strategy worked brilliantly. Harrison won a landslide victory in the Electoral College, defeating incumbent President Martin Van Buren, who was blamed for the economic depression that had begun in 1837. The Panic of 1837 and the subsequent hard times had made Van Buren deeply unpopular, and voters were ready for change. Harrison's victory marked the first time the Whig Party had won the presidency, and there was great excitement and anticipation about what his administration would accomplish. The Whigs controlled Congress as well, and they had ambitious plans for economic legislation, including the re-establishment of a national bank and higher tariffs to protect American industry. Harrison traveled to Washington for his inauguration in early 1841, and he was determined to prove that despite his age he was vigorous and capable. On March 4, 1841, Inauguration Day was cold and wet with freezing rain and strong winds. Harrison refused to wear a coat or hat. He wanted to demonstrate his hardiness and strength. He delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, speaking for nearly 2 hours in the harsh weather. The address was over 8,000 words and covered topics ranging from Roman history to the proper limits of executive power. Harrison wanted to show that he was learned and thoughtful, not just a military hero but a statesman with serious ideas about governance. But the lengthy outdoor speech in terrible weather may have been a fatal mistake. Within days of the inauguration, Harrison developed a cold that quickly worsened. His doctors diagnosed him with pneumonia, and he was confined to his bed in the White House. In the 19th century, before antibiotics, pneumonia was often fatal, especially in elderly patients. Harrison's condition deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from fever, chills, and difficulty breathing. His doctors tried various treatments, including bloodletting and opium, but nothing helped. Harrison became delirious and weak, and it was clear he was dying. On April 4, 1841, exactly 1 month after his inauguration, William Henry Harrison died. He had served as president for only 31 days, the shortest term of any American president. His death shocked the nation and created a constitutional crisis because it was unclear what should happen next. The Constitution stated that in case of the president's death, the vice president would assume the duties of the office, but it did not explicitly say whether the vice president would actually become president or would merely serve as acting president. John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, quickly asserted that he was now the president in his own right, not merely an acting president, and he took the full oath of office and moved into the White House. Tyler's decision to assume the full presidency set an important precedent that would be followed in all subsequent cases of presidential death or resignation. But Tyler's presidency was controversial and difficult. He had been chosen as Harrison's running mate primarily to balance the ticket and attract Southern votes, but his political views were quite different from those of most Whig leaders. Tyler vetoed much of the Whig legislative agenda, including bills to create a national bank, and he clashed repeatedly with Whig leaders in Congress. Eventually, the Whigs expelled Tyler from the party, and he became a president without a party, serving out Harrison's term in increasing isolation. Harrison's death meant that his presidency left almost no mark on American history. He served too briefly to accomplish anything significant or to shape the direction of the government. His main historical importance lies in the precedent set by his death regarding presidential succession and in the campaign techniques pioneered by the Whigs in 1840, which emphasized image and personality over substance and policy. The log cabin and hard cider campaign became a model for future political campaigns and demonstrated the power of popular enthusiasm and mass marketing in Democratic politics. Harrison was buried in North Bend, Ohio, at his family's property overlooking the Ohio River. His widow Anna received a pension from Congress, but she struggled financially for the rest of her life. One of Harrison's grandsons, Benjamin Harrison, would later become the 23rd President of the United States, serving from 1889 to 1893 and becoming the only grandson of a president to also hold the office. William Henry Harrison's legacy is thus somewhat paradoxical. He was a significant figure in the early history of the American frontier and a successful military commander who played an important role in wresting control of the Northwest Territory from Native Americans and the British, but his presidency was so brief that it barely registered in the historical record. Harrison's life embodied many of the contradictions and complexities of early American history. He came from Virginia aristocracy but made his career on the rough frontier. He fought to expand American territory and open it to settlement, but the methods he used to acquire Native American lands were often duplicitous and unjust. He benefited from the democratic expansion of voting rights and the growth of popular politics, but his most famous campaign was based more on manufactured image than on genuine discussion of issues. He was elected in a landslide to lead the nation but died before he could exercise any real leadership. In the end, William Henry Harrison remains a footnote in presidential history, remembered primarily for dying in office and for the catchy campaign slogan that helped elect him rather than for any lasting achievements or contributions to American government and society. James K. Polk was a determined Tennessee politician and masterful strategist who became one of America's most consequential presidents. James K. Polk, the 11th United States President, was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina on November 2, 1795. He came from a family of Scottish-Irish descent. He had a frail constitution in his youth. Polk's family moved to Tennessee when he was a boy, seeking better opportunities in the expanding frontier. He was educated at home initially due to his poor health. When he was 17 years old, Polk underwent a dangerous surgery to remove gallstones without anesthesia, an ordeal that nearly killed him but seemed to strengthen his resolve and determination for the rest of his life. After recovering from his surgery, Polk threw himself into his studies with remarkable intensity. He enrolled at the University of North Carolina in 1816 and graduated with honors in 1818. He was known as a serious student who excelled in mathematics and the classics. Polk was not a natural orator like Henry Clay or Daniel Webster, but he compensated with tireless preparation and an encyclopedic command of facts and figures. After graduation, he returned to Tennessee to study law under the tutelage of Felix Grundy, one of the most prominent attorneys in Nashville. Polk was admitted to the bar in 1820 and began practicing law in Columbia, Tennessee. He quickly established himself as a skilled lawyer and a rising figure in Tennessee politics. In 1823, Polk was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. He was a protege of Andrew Jackson, the military hero who would soon become president. Polk aligned himself completely with Jackson's political philosophy and became one of his most loyal supporters. In 1824, Polk married Sarah Childress, the daughter of a wealthy merchant and planter. Sarah was educated, intelligent, and politically astute. She would become one of Polk's most trusted advisors throughout his political career. The marriage was a partnership in every sense. Sarah had no children, but she devoted herself entirely to advancing her husband's political ambitions. She managed his correspondence, advised him on political strategy, and served as his closest confidant. In 1825, Polk was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He would serve in the House for 14 years, eventually becoming Speaker of the House in 1835. Polk was a fierce partisan who fought for Jackson's agenda with unwavering loyalty. He supported Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States, believing like Jackson that the bank represented concentrated financial power that threatened democratic institutions. Polk earned the nickname Young Hickory because of his devotion to Old Hickory Andrew Jackson. As Speaker of the House, Polk was a skilled parliamentary tactician who controlled the flow of legislation and managed the Democratic majority with an iron hand. He was not beloved, but he was respected for his fairness and his mastery of House rules and procedures. In 1839, Polk left Congress to run for governor of Tennessee. He won the election and served as governor from 1839 to 1841. But his time as governor was difficult. The national economy was in depression and Tennessee faced severe financial problems. Polk lost his re-election bid in 1841 and lost again when he ran for governor in 1843. These defeats were devastating to Polk, who had never lost an election before. Many political observers thought his career was finished. Polk was 48 years old and appeared to be a has-been politician with no future prospects. But Polk was not ready to give up. He set his sights on the vice presidency in 1844. The Democratic Party was deeply divided over the question of Texas annexation and the expansion of slavery into new territories. The leading candidate for the Democratic nomination was Martin Van Buren, the former president who had lost his re-election bid in 1840. But Van Buren made a fatal mistake. He came out against the immediate annexation of Texas, fearing it would provoke war with Mexico and inflame sectional tensions over slavery. Andrew Jackson, who still wielded enormous influence in the Democratic Party, was furious with Van Buren. Jackson believed that Texas must be annexed to secure American interests and prevent British interference in North America. At the Democratic Convention in Baltimore in May 1844, Van Buren could not secure the two-thirds majority needed for the nomination. The convention deadlocked through multiple ballots. On the ninth ballot, the delegates turned to James K. Polk as a compromise candidate. Polk was the first dark horse candidate in American presidential history. He had not even been considered for the presidency when the convention began. The Whig Party nominated Henry Clay, the great compromiser who had dominated American politics for 3 decades. Clay was confident of victory. He supposedly asked, "Who is James K. Polk?" when he heard of his opponent's nomination. The question became a Whig campaign slogan meant to mock Polk's relative obscurity on the national stage. But Polk ran an aggressive campaign focused on territorial expansion. His platform called for the re-annexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon. The Oregon Territory was jointly occupied by Britain and the United States, and there was growing sentiment for American control of the entire territory up to the 54° 40' latitude line, the southern border of Russian Alaska. 54-40 or fight became a rallying cry for expansionist Democrats. Polk also benefited from the third-party candidacy of James Birney, who ran on the anti-slavery Liberty Party ticket. Birney drew votes away from Clay in key states like New York. In the end, Polk won one of the closest elections in American history. He defeated Clay by fewer than 40,000 votes out of nearly 3 million cast. Polk won the Electoral College 170 to 105. James K. Polk was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1845. He was 49 years old, the youngest president elected up to that time. In his inaugural address, Polk made clear his commitment to territorial expansion. He declared that the American claim to Oregon was clear and unquestionable, and that Texas should be admitted to the Union as soon as possible. Polk was a man with a mission. He had specific goals he wanted to accomplish, and he was determined to achieve them all in a single term. Polk privately told his Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, that he had 4 great objectives for his presidency. First, he would reduce the tariff. Second, he would re-establish an independent treasury. Third, he would settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain. Fourth, he would acquire California from Mexico. Polk set to work immediately with characteristic intensity. He worked long hours every day, often late into the night. He involved himself in every detail of government operations. He was a micromanager who trusted few people and delegated little authority. Polk kept a detailed diary throughout his presidency, recording his thoughts, his frustrations, and his assessments of the people around him. The diary reveals a man who was suspicious, thin-skinned, and convinced that he was surrounded by incompetents and self-seekers. Polk had few friends and little patience for small talk or social pleasantries. He was all business all the time. In December 1845, Texas was admitted to the Union as the 28th state. Mexico had warned that annexation would be considered an act of war. Mexico had never recognized Texas' independence after the Texas Revolution of 1836 and considered Texas to be a rebellious province. The admission of Texas immediately created a crisis. There was also a boundary dispute. Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border, while Mexico insisted the border was the Nueces River farther north. Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor to the disputed territory between the two rivers. He also sent diplomat John Slidell to Mexico City with an offer to purchase California and New Mexico and to settle the Texas boundary dispute. The Mexican government refused to receive Slidell. The Mexicans were in no mood to negotiate the sale of their territory to the United States. In April 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and attacked American forces. 11 American soldiers were killed. Polk now had his justification for war. He told Congress that Mexico had invaded American territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Congress declared war on Mexico on May 13, 1846. The Mexican-American War had begun. The war was controversial from the start. Many Northerners believed it was a war of aggression designed to extend slavery into new territories. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln repeatedly challenged Polk to identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil. But Polk pressed forward with the war effort. He was determined to achieve his territorial objectives. The war went well for the United States. American forces won victory after victory. General Zachary Taylor defeated the Mexicans at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May 1846. In September, Taylor captured the city of Monterrey. In February 1847, Taylor won a decisive victory at the Battle of Buena Vista against a much larger Mexican force commanded by General Santa Anna. Meanwhile, General Stephen Kearny led an expedition that captured New Mexico and California. And General Winfield Scott launched an amphibious invasion at Veracruz and fought his way inland toward Mexico City. Scott's campaign was a brilliant military achievement. He defeated the Mexicans in a series of battles and captured Mexico City in September 1847. The war was effectively over. While the war was being fought, Polk was also dealing with the Oregon question. Britain and the United States had been jointly occupying Oregon for decades. Polk had campaigned on 50-40 or fight, but he knew that war with Britain over Oregon was not practical, especially while fighting Mexico. Polk negotiated a compromise with Britain. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 established the border between the United States and British Canada at the 49th parallel, extending the existing border westward to the Pacific Ocean. The United States gained the territory that would become Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Polk achieved his third objective without firing a shot. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas and ceded California and New Mexico to the United States. In return, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and assumed over $3 million in claims by American citizens against Mexico. The Mexican cession added over 500,000 square miles to the United States, including all or part of the future states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Polk had achieved his fourth objective. In less than 4 years, Polk had expanded the territory of the United States by more than 1 million square miles. The continental United States now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Polk also achieved his domestic policy objectives. In 1846, Congress passed the Walker Tariff, which significantly reduced tariff rates. Polk believed that high tariffs benefited manufacturers at the expense of farmers and consumers. The lower tariff was a victory for Polk's democratic philosophy of limited government and free trade. Also in 1846, Congress re-established the independent treasury system that had been created under Van Buren but abolished under the Whigs. The independent treasury kept government funds separate from private banks. Polk believed this protected the government from the instability and corruption of the banking system. Polk had accomplished all 4 of his major objectives. But the territorial expansion that Polk achieved came at an enormous cost. The acquisition of vast new territories reopened the bitter debate over slavery. Would slavery be permitted in the new territories, or would they be free? The question threatened to tear the nation apart. In 1846, Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a provision that would ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House but failed in the Senate. The proviso became a rallying point for anti-slavery forces and a source of outrage in the South. Polk opposed the Wilmot Proviso. He believed the slavery question should be left to the people of each territory to decide for themselves. But Polk's territorial expansion had made the slavery issue unavoidable. The sectional crisis that would lead to the Civil War 13 years later had its roots in Polk's expansionist policies. Polk kept his promise to serve only 1 term. He was exhausted by the demands of the presidency and his health was failing. He had worked himself nearly to death. Polk left office on March 4, 1849 and returned to Tennessee with Sarah. He was only 53 years old, but he looked much older. His hair had turned gray and his face was deeply lined. Polk had driven himself relentlessly for 4 years and his body had paid the price. He began a tour of the South but soon fell ill with cholera. He returned to his home in Nashville where his condition worsened. James K. Polk died on June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving office. He was the youngest former president to die. Polk's presidency is one of the most remarkable in American history. He set clear goals and achieved every one of them. He expanded the United States to the Pacific Ocean and made America a continental power. He was a president who knew what he wanted and had the determination and skill to get it. But Polk's legacy is complicated. His territorial expansion came through war with Mexico, a war that many considered unjust and aggressive. The territories he acquired led directly to the sectional crisis over slavery that culminated in the Civil War. Polk himself owned slaves throughout his life. He bought and sold enslaved people and profited from their labor. He never questioned the morality of slavery and defended it as a constitutional right. When he died, he did not free his slaves. They remained in bondage under Sarah's ownership until the end of the Civil War. Historians have debated Polk's place in American history for generations. Some rank him as a near-great president who achieved his objectives and expanded American power and prosperity. Others view him as an aggressive imperialist whose policies led to unnecessary war and deepened the divisions that would tear the nation apart. Polk was a man of his time who believed in manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to expand across the continent. He believed that American expansion would spread democracy and opportunity. He did not foresee, or perhaps did not care, that his policies would lead to catastrophic consequences. What is clear is that James K. Polk was one of the most effective presidents in American history if effectiveness is measured by accomplishing stated goals. He was a master of political strategy and legislative tactics. He was disciplined, focused, and tireless in pursuit of his objectives. He dominated his cabinet and controlled his party. He was not a great communicator or an inspiring leader, but he was a supremely competent executive who got things done. Polk understood power and how to use it. He was willing to take risks and make difficult decisions. He was not paralyzed by doubt or deterred by criticism. He knew what he believed and he acted on those beliefs with unwavering determination. Polk's marriage to Sarah was central to his success. Sarah was intelligent, politically savvy, and completely devoted to her husband's career. She served as his advisor, his confidant, and his partner in every sense. She managed the White House with efficiency and grace. She hosted receptions and dinners that were important for political networking, but she banned dancing and card playing because of her strict Presbyterian beliefs. Sarah was deeply religious and she brought a moral seriousness to the White House. After Polk's death, Sarah lived for another 42 years. She never remarried. She devoted herself to preserving her husband's memory and defending his legacy. She remained active in Democratic Party politics and was consulted by politicians and historians who wanted to understand the Polk presidency. The Mexican-American War that Polk prosecuted so vigorously transformed the United States. The war demonstrated American military power and proved that the United States could project force beyond its borders. The war also created military heroes like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott who would play important roles in American politics. Many of the officers who fought in the Mexican-American War, including Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, would face each other again in the Civil War. The war gave them valuable combat experience and tested their leadership abilities. Grant later wrote in his memoirs that the Mexican-American War was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. But at the time, Grant was a young lieutenant who followed orders and did his duty. The discovery of gold in California in 1848, just days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, vindicated Polk's territorial ambitions in the eyes of many Americans. The California gold rush brought hundreds of thousands of people to the West and created enormous wealth. California's admission as a free state in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850 further complicated the sectional balance between North and South. The territories that Polk acquired became the battleground for the struggle over slavery's expansion. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in Kansas and Nebraska in the 1850s led to violence and bloodshed that foreshadowed the Civil War. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and the Dred Scott Decision of 1857 were all attempts to resolve the crisis created by territorial expansion. Polk's commitment to manifest destiny reflected the attitudes of many Americans in the 1840s. Americans believed they had a God-given right and duty to expand across the continent. They believed American institutions and values were superior and should be spread to new territories. This belief justified the displacement and destruction of Native American peoples who had lived on the land for thousands of years. It justified war with Mexico to seize Mexican territory. It reflected a sense of racial and cultural superiority that was widespread in 19th-century America. Polk never questioned these assumptions. He believed that American expansion was inevitable and beneficial. He saw himself as an instrument of destiny fulfilling America's continental mission. The Polk presidency demonstrates both the possibilities and the dangers of strong executive leadership. Polk showed that a determined president with clear objectives can accomplish great things. He expanded American territory, strengthened American power, and achieved his policy goals. But he also showed that presidential power can be used to pursue policies that are morally questionable and have unintended consequences. The war with Mexico was controversial then and remains controversial now. The territories Polk acquired led to a crisis that nearly destroyed the nation. Strong leadership is not always wise leadership. Effectiveness is not the same as righteousness. James K. Polk died believing he had served his country well. He had fulfilled his campaign promises and achieved his stated objectives. He had made America a continental nation stretching from sea to shining sea. He could not have known that the territories he acquired would become the fault line that would split the nation apart. He could not have foreseen that the question of slavery in the territories would lead to the bloodiest war in American history. Or perhaps he did foresee it but believed the risk was worth taking. Polk was a gambler who bet that America could absorb vast new territories without destroying itself. He won his bet in the short term, but the long-term consequences were catastrophic. Today James K. Polk is not well remembered by most Americans. He does not have the fame of Washington or Lincoln or the Roosevelts. He is not celebrated in popular culture or commemorated with grand monuments. But historians recognize his significance. He was a consequential president who changed the map of America and set in motion forces that would shape the nation's future. He was a man of limited vision but unlimited determination. He was a skilled politician but not a great statesman. He achieved his goals but at a terrible cost. He expanded American power but deepened American divisions. He was in the end a tragic figure whose greatest achievements contained the seeds of disaster. James K. Polk was the president who made America a continental nation and in doing so helped set America on the path to civil war. Stephen F. Austin was a visionary colonizer and diplomatic statesman who became known as the Father of Texas. Stephen Fuller Austin, the impresario who brought American settlers to Mexican Texas, was born in Austinville, Virginia on November 3, 1793. He came from a family of entrepreneurs and pioneers. Austin had a dignified and measured demeanor. His father Moses Austin was a prominent businessman and land speculator who had made and lost fortunes in mining and banking. Stephen was educated at Bacon Academy in Connecticut and later at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, receiving a classical education that prepared him for leadership. After completing his studies, young Austin returned to Missouri where his family had relocated. He worked in his father's lead mining business and served in the territorial legislature. Austin showed early promise in both business and politics. He was appointed as a judge and proved himself capable in matters of law and governance. In 1820, Moses Austin traveled to San Antonio to request permission from Spanish authorities to establish an American colony in Texas. The elder Austin received approval but died in June 1821 before he could fulfill his dream. On his deathbed, Moses Austin asked his son Stephen to carry out the colonization plan. Stephen F. Austin was reluctant at first to take on this enormous responsibility. He had his own plans and ambitions in Missouri. But family duty and the promise of opportunity drew him to Texas. In August 1821, the 27-year-old Austin arrived in Texas to continue his father's work. He found a land of vast prairies, dense forests, and untamed rivers. Texas was a frontier region with few settlements and even fewer resources. Austin had to negotiate with both Spanish and then Mexican authorities as Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. He traveled to Mexico City to confirm his father's grant and secure the legal framework for his colony. Austin spent nearly a year in the Mexican capital, learning Spanish, studying Mexican law, and building relationships with government officials. He proved to be a skilled diplomat and negotiator. Austin's contract allowed him to bring 300 families to settle in Texas. These settlers became known as the Old 300. Austin was meticulous in selecting colonists. He wanted farmers, craftsmen, and professionals who would build stable communities. He rejected troublemakers and those who might cause problems with Mexican authorities. Austin established his colonial capital at San Felipe de Austin on the Brazos River. From this headquarters, he managed the complex task of surveying land, assigning grants, and governing the growing colony. Austin served as impresario, judge, military commander, and father figure to his colonists. He resolved disputes, organized defenses against Indian raids, and maintained order with limited resources. The impresario system required Austin to provide land to settlers at minimal cost while he received compensation in land for each family he brought to Texas. Austin's responsibilities were enormous and the financial rewards were slow in coming. Life on the Texas frontier was harsh and dangerous. Settlers faced threats from Comanche and Karankawa raids, disease, isolation, and the challenges of breaking new ground. Austin worked tirelessly to protect and support his colonists. He organized ranging companies to patrol the territory and defend against Indian attacks. These ranging companies were precursors to the famous Texas Rangers. Austin understood that survival depended on cooperation and discipline. He established laws and regulations for his colony, creating a framework of governance that balanced American traditions with Mexican requirements. Austin was a slave owner, as were many of his colonists who came from the American South. Slavery was a contentious issue in Mexican Texas. Mexico had abolished slavery, but Austin negotiated exemptions and workarounds to allow his colonists to bring enslaved people to work their land. This issue would create ongoing tension between the American settlers and Mexican authorities. By the mid-1820s, Austin's colony was thriving. More settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of cheap, fertile land. Austin received additional contracts to bring more families to Texas. His success attracted other impresarios who established their own colonies. Austin became the most prominent American in Texas and the de facto leader of the Anglo-American community. He corresponded with Mexican officials, mediated conflicts, and advocated for the interests of the settlers. Austin believed in working within the Mexican system. He encouraged his colonists to become Mexican citizens, learn Spanish, and respect Mexican law. He saw Texas as part of Mexico and himself as a loyal Mexican citizen. Austin was not a revolutionary or a rebel. He was a pragmatic builder who wanted stability and prosperity for his colony. However, tensions between the American settlers and the Mexican government grew throughout the late 1820s and early 1830s. The settlers, mostly from the United States, brought American customs, language, and expectations. They chafed under Mexican laws they didn't understand and regulations they found burdensome. Mexico, meanwhile, grew concerned about the flood of American immigration. Mexican officials worried that Texas would be lost to American expansion. In 1830, Mexico passed laws restricting further American immigration and imposing new taxes and trade restrictions. Austin traveled again to Mexico City to negotiate relief for the colonists. He spent months petitioning officials and seeking compromises. Austin walked a difficult line, trying to satisfy both his colonists and the Mexican government. The political situation in Mexico was unstable. Presidents and constitutions changed frequently. In 1833, General Antonio López de Santa Anna came to power. Initially, Santa Anna presented himself as a federalist who supported state rights. Austin and other Texans hoped he would be sympathetic to their concerns. Austin was sent to Mexico City as a representative of Texas to present petitions for greater autonomy, including separation from Coahuila and the creation of a separate state of Texas. Austin spent over a year in Mexico City negotiating with officials. He made some progress on certain issues but failed to achieve statehood for Texas. Frustrated by the lack of response, Austin wrote a letter to officials in San Antonio suggesting that Texas should organize its own state government even without Mexican approval. This letter was intercepted by authorities and Austin was arrested for sedition in January 1834. Austin spent nearly 2 years imprisoned in Mexico City. He was held in a dungeon cell for several months before being moved to better quarters. He was never formally tried but remained under arrest. During his imprisonment, Austin's health deteriorated and his faith in the Mexican government eroded. The experience transformed Austin from a loyal Mexican citizen into someone who questioned whether Texas could remain part of Mexico. While Austin was imprisoned, the political situation in Mexico and Texas continued to deteriorate. Santa Anna abandoned federalism and established a centralist dictatorship. He dissolved state legislatures and concentrated power in Mexico City. These actions alarmed not just Texans but Mexicans throughout the country who valued local autonomy and constitutional government. Austin was finally released in July 1835 and returned to Texas in September. He found the colony on the brink of war. Mexican troops had been sent to Texas to enforce centralist policies and disarm the colonists. Skirmishes had already occurred. Austin, the man who had spent 15 years building peaceful relations with Mexico, now found himself swept up in the movement toward revolution. In October 1835, fighting broke out between Texan settlers and Mexican forces at Gonzales. Austin was chosen to command the volunteer Texan army that marched on San Antonio. He was not a natural military leader. Austin was a diplomat and administrator, not a soldier. But he was respected and trusted by the colonists. Austin led the siege of San Antonio but struggled to maintain discipline among the independent-minded volunteers. The Texan forces were disorganized and lacked supplies and training. In November 1835, while the siege continued, Austin was selected to travel to the United States as a commissioner to seek support for the Texas cause. He left military command to others and embarked on a diplomatic mission. Austin traveled to cities including New Orleans, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Washington, giving speeches, writing letters, and meeting with officials and potential supporters. He sought money, volunteers, and political recognition for Texas. Austin was effective in this role, using his credibility and eloquence to generate sympathy and support for Texas independence. He raised funds and recruited volunteers who would travel to Texas to join the fight. Austin also sought to influence American public opinion and government policy regarding Texas. While Austin was in the United States, the Texas Revolution intensified. In December 1835, Texan forces captured San Antonio after a fierce battle. But in March 1836, Santa Anna led a Mexican army north to crush the rebellion. The Mexican forces besieged the Alamo Mission in San Antonio, where a small force of Texans had fortified themselves. After a 13-day siege, the Mexican army overran the Alamo, killing all the defenders including famous frontiersmen James Bowie and Davy Crockett. Weeks later, Mexican forces executed hundreds of Texan prisoners at Goliad. These events shocked and enraged Texans and Americans. Meanwhile, on March 2, 1836, Texas delegates meeting at Washington on the Brazos declared independence from Mexico. They drafted a constitution and established the Republic of Texas. The new republic needed to survive militarily before it could exist politically. General Sam Houston commanded the Texan army as it retreated eastward before Santa Anna's advancing forces. In April 1836, Houston turned and attacked the Mexican army at San Jacinto. In a surprise assault lasting only 18 minutes, the Texans defeated Santa Anna's forces and captured the Mexican general himself. The Battle of San Jacinto secured Texas independence. Austin returned to Texas in June 1836 after the revolution had been won. He found a new republic struggling to establish itself. Texas needed leaders, and Austin's experience and reputation made him an obvious choice for high office. In September 1836, Texas held its first election. Sam Houston was elected president of the Republic of Texas. Austin ran for president but lost to Houston. The defeat was disappointing but not surprising. Houston was the military hero who had won independence. Austin was the diplomat and colonizer whose contributions were less dramatic but equally important. Houston appointed Austin as Secretary of State for the new republic. Austin accepted the position and threw himself into the work of building a functioning government. He dealt with foreign relations, worked on treaties with Indian tribes, and helped establish governmental procedures and policies. Austin worked from the temporary capital at Columbia, Texas. He lived in a simple cabin and worked long hours despite declining health. The years of hardship, imprisonment, and stress had taken their toll on Austin's constitution. He suffered from pneumonia and other ailments. Austin never married and had no children. He devoted his entire adult life to the colonization and development of Texas. His personal sacrifices were enormous. He spent his own money to support the colony, often going into debt. He endured years away from any settled home, living on the frontier and traveling on difficult diplomatic missions. On December 27, 1836, just 3 months after Texas independence was secured and only weeks after taking office as Secretary of State, Stephen F. Austin died of pneumonia at the age of 43. He died in Columbia, Texas, in a small cabin, attended by friends but far from any family. Austin's death was mourned throughout Texas. The man who had brought American civilization to Texas and who had navigated the complex path from Mexican colony to independent republic was gone just as the new nation was beginning. Austin died in poverty despite his land holdings because he had invested everything in Texas and received little financial return. At his death, Austin's character and contributions were recognized by those who knew him. He was remembered as a man of integrity, patience, and dedication. Austin was not a fiery orator or a dashing military hero. He was a careful planner, a skilled negotiator, and a persistent advocate who achieved his goals through diplomacy rather than confrontation. The capital of Texas was named Austin in his honor. Counties in Texas and other states bear his name. Stephen F. Austin's legacy is the American settlement of Texas and the foundation of what would become the 28th state of the United States. Austin brought thousands of settlers to Texas, established functioning communities, and created the conditions that made Texas independence possible. Without Austin's colonization efforts, Texas might have remained an empty frontier of Mexico or been settled in a completely different way. Austin's vision was of Texas as a land of opportunity where hard-working people could build prosperous lives. He succeeded in creating that opportunity even though he personally gained little material benefit. Austin's relationship with slavery remains a complicated part of his legacy. He facilitated the expansion of slavery into Texas to attract Southern settlers, even as he privately expressed reservations about the institution. He worked to circumvent Mexican anti-slavery laws, prioritizing the growth of his colony over moral concerns about human bondage. This aspect of Austin's career cannot be ignored or excused, though it must be understood in the context of his time and place. Austin was a man of contradictions. He was a Mexican citizen who led American colonization. He was a peaceful diplomat who became a revolutionary. He was a careful planner who took enormous risks. He was a private man who became a public leader. He sought wealth but died poor. He wanted stability but lived through constant turmoil. Stephen F. Austin's life spanned a transformative period in North American history. He was born shortly after the United States Constitution was ratified and died as Texas was becoming an independent nation that would soon join the United States. Austin participated in the westward expansion that would define 19th-century America. He was an agent of American manifest destiny, though he would not have used that term. Austin saw himself as a colonizer bringing civilization to a wilderness, though that wilderness was home to indigenous peoples and was part of a sovereign nation. The ethical complexities of colonization and expansion are part of Austin's story and must be grappled with in any honest assessment of his life. Austin's diplomatic skills were perhaps his greatest asset. He could negotiate with Mexican officials, manage fractious colonists, deal with Indian leaders, and appeal to American supporters. He spoke multiple languages and understood different cultures and perspectives. Austin was patient when patience was needed and decisive when action was required. He built relationships and trust over years of consistent behavior. These skills allowed him to achieve what more aggressive or confrontational leaders could not have accomplished. Austin's failure to prevent the Texas Revolution might be seen as his greatest defeat. He spent 15 years trying to make the Mexican-Texan relationship work. He believed that accommodation and compromise could satisfy both Mexican sovereignty and Texan aspirations. He was wrong. The cultural, political, and economic differences were too great. The forces pushing toward conflict were stronger than Austin's diplomatic efforts. Yet even in failure, Austin's approach had value. He exhausted peaceful options before resorting to revolution. He gave Mexico every chance to address Texan grievances. When war came, Austin and other Texans could claim they had been forced into it. The Texas that Stephen F. Austin created became a template for American expansion. The impresario system, the mixing of cultures, the tension between local autonomy and central authority, the role of slavery, the displacement of indigenous peoples, all these elements of the Texas story would repeat themselves as America expanded westward. Austin was a pioneer not just geographically but in demonstrating how American settlement would transform the continent. His methods and his challenges foreshadowed what would happen in California, New Mexico, Oregon, and other territories. Stephen F. Austin died too young to see Texas join the United States in 1845 or to witness the Mexican-American War that followed. He did not live to see his colony grow into a great state. But he laid the foundation for all of it. Austin's colonists and their descendants built the ranches, towns, and cities of Texas. They fought in Texas wars and contributed to Texas culture. The old 300 families and those who followed created a society that blended Southern, Mexican, and frontier influences into something distinctively Texan. Today, Stephen F. Austin is remembered as the Father of Texas, a title that captures his essential role in Texas history. Like the title Father of his country for George Washington, it acknowledges that Austin was the indispensable man whose vision, effort, and leadership made possible the creation of a new political entity. Without Washington, there might have been no United States. Without Austin, there might have been no Anglo-American Texas. Both men were reluctant revolutionaries who preferred peaceful development to violent conflict but who accepted revolution when it became necessary. Both men sacrificed personal comfort and wealth for their causes. Both men died revered by those they led. The comparison is not perfect. Washington achieved far more and led a much larger and more significant revolution. But within the context of Texas history, Austin's role was foundational and his contributions were immeasurable. He was the man who made Texas possible, and for that, he deserves to be remembered and honored even as we critically examine the full complexity of his legacy and the consequences of the colonization he led.